This is the Troubles Podcast, a podcast which explores the violence and bloodshed that occurred in Northern Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, and Great Britain as two sides waged a bloody conflict over the status of Northern Ireland. A quick note before we begin: this podcast deals with some violent subject matter which may not be suitable for a younger audience. Young people in Ireland in the 60s only wanted to be in one place, in their local dance hall at the weekend, dancing to their favourite music. This was the era of the showband. A showband is a type of band that plays covers of the most popular songs of the period. In Ireland, there were some very popular showbands, such as the Dixies and the Royals, but it was the Miami who were the most loved. The Miami Showband was a band that spanned decades and often had new members shuffle in and out. Originally formed in 1961, after the band, the Downbeats Quartet, were taken over by manager Tom Doherty, who then changed their name to the Miami Showband. The Miami quickly became one of the most popular bands in Ireland and would tour all over the country to perform in crowded dance halls. The band was first fronted by Irishman Jimmy Hart, who was working and studying at the time. The Miami were soon playing 5 to 6 shows a week all over Ireland, and it wasn't long before Jimmy decided to focus on his studies and part ways with the band. He was replaced by Dickie Rock, who was an extremely popular frontman and was loved by his fans for his confidence and arrogance on stage. His fans up the front used to shout, "Spit on me, Dickie," and this slogan has stuck with him for years. The Miami went on to enjoy critical and commercial success over the years, frequently getting number 1 on the charts, but in 1967 they completely reshuffled with the intention of going in a new direction. It was here that Fran O'Toole joined the band on the keyboard. After 10 years with the Miami, Dickie decided to go solo in 1972, and the search began for a new face for the band. This was an era where Beatles mania existed, and it was important to have a charismatic, attractive person fronting the band. After 2 years of trying, and never quite finding the right frontman to fill Dickie's shoes, they decided to look at the existing members, instead of trying to pull someone in from the outside. Fran O'Toole had been with the band a few years, and was young, talented and attractive. He also had a massive appeal with younger audiences. So in 1974, he became the new frontman of the band. He was so popular that the band was sometimes known as Fran O'Toole and the Miami. By 1975, the lineup consisted of 6 people: Des Lee on saxophone, Brian McCoy playing the trumpet, Tony Geraghty on the guitar, Fran O'Toole as the vocalist, Steve Travers on bass guitar, and Ray Miller on drums. Their song, "Clap Your Hands and Stomp Your Feet," was an incredibly popular song that got everyone in the dance halls up and dancing. Fran was proving to be the perfect frontman for the band. Little did he know that he would only get to enjoy this success for a short amount of time before tragedy would strike. The Troubles were in full swing in 1975, and tit-for-tat violence against Protestants and Catholics was an everyday occurrence in Northern Ireland. Throughout this turmoil, the showbands continued to tour the entire Ireland. Even at the height of the Troubles, the music never stopped, and many needed the relief that a night of dancing could bring, especially when living in what was considered a war zone at times. The Miami were equally as popular in Northern Ireland as they were in the Republic. The The band believed that music and politics were completely separate things and didn't often feel threatened by the violence going on around them. They themselves were comprised of both Irish and Northern Irish members, with Brian hailing from Belfast and Ray from Antrim. They saw playing in Northern Ireland as like playing in a miniature version of London. It felt a bit trendier than playing in the Republic, and the Miami always felt that they had to up their game when playing there and make sure they were able to play all of the latest songs. Formed in 1966, the Ulster Volunteer Force, or UVF for short, were a unionist or loyalist paramilitary organisation. Their aim was to defend Northern Ireland against Republicans, especially the IRA. And like with the IRA, it was often civilians who bore the brunt of their violence. The UVF committed many attacks on Catholics in Northern Ireland, and it is also alleged that the gang were responsible for the bombings in Monaghan and Dublin, killing 34 individuals and injuring 300 others. Portadown is a small town in Northern Ireland, slightly south of Belfast. And it was here and in the surrounding area that the Mid-Ulster Brigade of the UVF operated. They were a notorious and dangerous group of loyalist extremists. On July 30th, 1975, the Miami travelled from Galway over to Banbridge in Northern Ireland to play a show in the Castle Ballroom. Banbridge is only 11 miles from Portadown, and the band were performing in the heart of the Mid-Ulster Brigade's territory. The Miami played to an adoring crowd, which was comprised of both Catholics and Protestants, who danced the night away. The show ended after midnight, and the 5 men packed up all their gear in a VW van and departed for Dublin at around 2 a.m. in the morning. Drummer Ray Miller brought his own car and went up to visit his parents in Antrim, so he was not in the van when it departed. Their manager, Brian Maguire, went on ahead in his car, with the band following a few minutes behind. Of the 5 men travelling in the van, only 2 of them would ever make it home. Halfway between Banbridge and Newry, the van was stopped at what appeared to be an Ulster Defence Regiment checkpoint. The UDR were an infantry regiment of the British Army, comprised of Northern Irish people. And bands like the Miami were accustomed to being stopped at military checkpoints whenever they were up north. They never saw these checkpoints as a threat, as they felt that their music had no part to play in the Northern Irish conflict. Some of the individuals who stopped them were wearing UDR fatigues, and the 5 band members were ordered out of the van and lined up. One of the members noticed that there was a man there dressed in an entirely different uniform, who had a British accent. This was unusual, because most members of the UDR would have Northern Irish accents, and they wouldn't be wearing soldiers' uniforms. Bass player Steve remembers. This other soldier appeared. Now this man was dressed completely differently. He was the real thing. He had it all. The others that we heard speaking had Northern accents. This man had a very well-educated English accent. I felt safe. Uniform to me meant law and order. They were there to protect us. But this was not the UDR or the British Army. These men were members of the Ulster Volunteer Force, dressed up to look like members of the Ulster Defence Regiment. The men had all the band members get out of the vehicle and line up at the rear of the van, with guns pointed at them. They were then told to state their names and addresses. Initially, the band weren't scared, as the men seemed friendly. But then, 2 of them opened up the rear of the van, and Steve began to worry that they would damage his guitar, which was in the back. He turned around to ask the men what they were doing, and one of them responded by punching him in the back and pushing him back into line with the other members. All of a sudden, there was a huge explosion. a bomb had exploded in the rear of the van. The loyalists then suddenly opened fire on the band members. Steve said, "The whole world turned rain, this amazing blood-red colour. The whole place seemed to stand still for a second, though I knew the van was blown to pieces in an instant." The UVF men who were at the rear of the van bore the brunt of the explosion and were killed instantly. The 5 band members were thrown into a nearby field from the force of the explosion. Then the UVF men opened fire on them. Band member Brian McCoy was the first person to be shot and killed in the gunfire. Members Fran and Tony took off running across the field, but the UVF caught up with them and executed them on the spot. Steve remembers hearing Fran plead for his life. In the end, Fran's pleas were ignored and he was shot 22 times in the face. As the gunfire ceased, Steve was lying face down in the grass and heard a man approaching him. He thought about getting up on his knees to beg for his life, but then decided against it and lay prone on the ground. But before the man could come any closer, another loyalist shouted from the road, "Come on, those bastards are dead. I got them with dum-dums." The man then turned and walked away. A dum-dum is an explosive bullet which causes huge internal damage to a body, and Steve had been shot in the right hip. He said, "It entered my right hip, it went up through my intestines, and it exploded into 13 pieces. The rest of it went through my left lung, which collapsed, and it exited under my left arm." Saxophonist Des Lee was thrown from the road and into a ditch from the blast. There was a fire spreading and Des needed to get out before he was burned alive. He made it back onto the road where he saw the scale of the damage done. There was blood, body parts and shrapnel all over the road. The frantic Des tried to wave down a car, but the first few wouldn't stop. Eventually, he flagged one down, which brought him to a Newry police station where he raised the alarm. James O'Neill was a Royal Ulster Constabulary scene of crime officer and was one of the first people to arrive at the scene of the massacre. He was trained as a forensic and fingerprint specialist and recalls his memories of arriving at the scene. The minibus was cut in 2 halves exactly on this hard shoulder. The tyres of the vehicle were burning, the hedge was scorched. There was just this smell of actually death about the place. Burning blood, burning tyres. It was a horrific incident to arrive at. 3 of the band members were executed on the spot, but 2 other men also died in the explosion that occurred. They were soon identified as Harris Boyle and Wesley Somerville, both of which had ties to the UVF. Upon investigating the scene, officers found the explosion was caused by a 15-pound gelignite bomb, that it had exploded with a huge amount of force and was heard from miles and miles away. The forensic team also found a number of items at the scene, including an abandoned Ford Cortina, UDR berets, and a pair of glasses. The glasses would end up providing vital evidence which could help identify another one of the attackers, James McDowell, due to the unusual prescription on the lenses. Within hours of the attack, the UVF issued a statement that read, "A UVF patrol, led by Major Boyle, was suspicious of 2 vehicles, a minibus and a car parked near the border. Major Boyle ordered his patrol to apprehend the occupants for questioning. As they were being questioned, Major Boyle and Lieutenant Somerville began to search the minibus. As they began to enter the vehicle, a bomb was detonated and both men were killed outright. At the precise moment of the explosion, the patrol came under intense automatic fire from the occupants of the other vehicle. The patrol sergeant immediately ordered fire to be returned. Using self-loading rifles and submachine guns, the patrol returned fire, killing 3 of their attackers and wounding another. The patrol later recovered 2 Armalite rifles and a pistol. The UVF maintains regular border patrols due to the continued activity of the Provisional IRA. The Mid-Ulster Battalion has also been assisting the South Down Armagh units since the IRA 4-kill booby trap, which killed 4 British soldiers. 3 UVF members are being treated for gunshot wounds after last night, but not in hospital. It would appear that the UVF patrol surprised members of a terrorist organisation transferring weapons to the Miami Showband minibus, and that an explosive device of some description was being carried by the Showband for an unlawful purpose. It is obvious, therefore, that the UVF patrol was justified in taking the action it did, and that the killing of the 3 Showband members should be regarded as justifiable homicide. The officers and agents of the Ulster Central Intelligence Agency commend the UVF on their actions and tender their deepest sympathy to the relatives of the 2 officers who died while attempting to remove the bomb from the minibus. Investigating officers soon began to piece together what happened, and their version was very different from the statement released by the UVF. It would appear that the 2 men looking into the back of the band's van were attempting to plant a bomb with a short-term fuse so that the vehicle would then pass into the Irish Republic, where it would explode, killing all the occupants of the van. This would then make it look like the Miami Showband was trafficking weapons across the border. In interviews with people affiliated with the UVF in recent years, the story has changed. They now claim that their intentions were different, and that the bomb was intended to explode much later on when the van was parked and the members were all in their homes. Another theory that was put forward is that this attack could provide an incentive for the Irish Republic to close their border with Northern Ireland. The open border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland meant that the IRA could commit crimes in Northern Ireland and then hide out in the Republic, where British officers could not follow them. British authorities also did not have faith that the Irish police force, called An Garda Síochána, would track down these paramilitaries. The open border was a thorn in the side of British and Northern Irish authorities. Wife of trumpet player Brian McCoy recalls how she found out her husband had passed away. She said, "I expected Brian home about 2, so I fell asleep and didn't hear anybody coming in, and I got a phone call at 7 o'clock in the morning from Brian's brother-in-law. He said, 'I heard there was a band ambushed at the border. I dunno, I got a bad feeling and I put the radio on to get the 8 o'clock news, and it announced Brian was killed.'" After a lengthy investigation, the RUC arrested 2 additional individuals, James McDowell and Thomas Crozier. These men had been members of the Ulster Defence Regiment. During the Troubles, there were many accusations that the UDR colluded with the UVF and other unionist paramilitary organisations. Rodney McDowell and Thomas Crozier were sentenced to 35 years in prison in 1976. John James Somerville was also arrested and sentenced to life in 1981. He was a brother to Wesley, who was killed in the initial blast. Thomas Crozier said on the night of the attack he had picked up 7 men and then set up the military checkpoint. He refused to name any of his accomplices, as he was afraid that his family would be attacked if he helped authorities. James McDowell was arrested because of his glasses, which were left at the scene. The prescription of the glasses was so specific that they were worn by 1 in 500,000 individuals. During interrogations, McDowell said of the night in question, quote, "There was very little planning. I only came into it because of my UDR connection and the fact that I had a uniform. I was given a submachine gun, but I had never fired it. I passed out when the explosion happened, and that was when I lost the gun, the glasses, and the beret. The 35-year sentence handed down to the men was the longest life sentences in the history of Northern Ireland, and the judge said that if the death penalty had not been abolished, then it would have been used in this case. The 3 men arrested were eventually released under the terms of the Good Friday Agreement in 1998. We will now discuss parts of this story of which answers have never been found and that people are still searching for today, over 40 years later. The identity of the British soldier with the English accent has never been found, though it has been suggested that it was that of Captain Robert Nyrak. He was a British Army officer who was working undercover in Belfast. There is also speculation that he is the one who organised the attack. Other sources alleged that Robin Jackson, who was also known as the Jackal, organised the attack. There has always been a lingering speculation that there may have been collusion between the UVF and British security forces. In 1972, nearly 100 weapons were stolen from an Ulster Defence Regiment base, and it is assumed that this was an inside job, and that the weapons were being used to arm the Ulster Volunteer Force. It has also been alleged that Jackson was involved in this attack as well. In the newest Netflix documentary released about the massacre, Steve said, "Almost every single weapon used in the Miami Showband murders originated from the UDR or from the police in Northern Ireland. Every one of them." In 2005, the Police Service of Northern Ireland set up the Historical Inquiries Team, which was an attempt to review every single death during the Troubles and try and answer questions. In later years, Steve managed to open a door between himself and higher figures with the UVF. He went on to meet the Craftsman, who was at the time second in command of the UVF. It was then that he was told that the UVF wanted the bomb to explode after the band members were home safely in their beds. But this went against what was found at the crime scene, in which the bomb was revealed to have a short-term fuse of 10 to 15 minutes. After he was released, John James Somerville became a committed Christian and said of the attacks, "I'm not going to make excuses for my past. I did what I did. Nobody coerced me. Nobody forced me. It was my own personal feelings and convictions at the time these things happened." When asked what he would say to families of the victims, he said, "Well, I would understand how they would feel, because I have had relatives killed and people affected that way. So I understand entirely. God has forgiven me, my past, and even the people that murdered my relatives. If they confess their sins to God and ask Him to show them mercy and save them, He'll do it. And I would have no quibble whatsoever. I don't care who they are, even if they murdered my own flesh and blood and they came through that door and they said they were saved. I'll accept them, no animosity against them." In October 2019, the British Ministry of Defence handed over a document naming the British officer who was involved in the planning and execution of the Miami Showband massacre. The documents were given to the solicitor representing Fran O'Toole's widow, and this is the first time that Captain Robert Nyrak has been publicly linked to these attacks. After the massacre, the band regrouped, and the surviving members, Steve and Ray, tried to continue playing with the new members brought in to replace the 3 that were killed. This was their main source of income, and they needed to keep working. But they could never shake the association with the massacre. By late 1976, Stephen Travers left and set aside his performing career to take up bass guitar tutoring. A few months later, in April 1977, Ray Miller quit and went to work as a car salesman in Antrim. By the 1980s, the social scene in Ireland was changing, and the era of the showband was coming to an end. And the bright dance halls where the showbands performed were soon replaced with discos, and soon the era of the showband was over. The Miami Showband Massacre remains as one of the most controversial massacres in the history of the Troubles. There are many questions that remain unanswered and many other family members waiting for closure. Some of those answers may reveal themselves in years to come, but others will be lost to time forever.